What is good, everybody? This is TAETRO. Today we're going to talk all about warping samples, or the basics of it at least. How do you take a sample from outside of Ableton Live and drop it into Ableton Live to get it to be the right tempo? Drum samples, it's a little easy. With other kinds of samples, it's a little difficult. But we're going to go through all the warp modes and how to play with timing with warping. This video is part of a bigger series, the Ableton Live for Beginners series, which you should check out before watching this episode if you need to know the core fundamentals of Ableton Live. I want to take you from knowing nothing about Ableton Live to being actually pretty skillful in being able to make your own music. All right, let's start by warping something easy like a drum loop. And the reason I say a drum loop is easy for Ableton Live, at least, to warp or to put in time is because it has very clear beats or transients. If I look at this sample, I can see every drum hit very, very clearly. Now let's give it a listen. Sounds like a pretty straightforward drum loop, and if I set up my loop brackets to loop this, it should loop relatively seamlessly. You would never know that it just looped. It worked automatically, a 4-bar loop, directly from just dropping it into Ableton Live. Perfect. Good job, Ableton Live. You did your job. But like I said, this is very easy for Ableton Live. Now, if you look at the sample title, which is not always correct, but if you look at the sample title, you can see that it says 81, and in a drum sample or a rhythmic sample, the number you see there will usually refer to the tempo of the sample. And if you look at Live's tempo up here, my BPM is set to 90. Since this sample is warped, it's automatically playing at 90 BPM. So if I turn on my metronome, you can hear it playing with the metronome. And if I change my tempo, the sample will change along. But you can see as I start to get lower, it starts to sound more or less and less natural, right? Sounds like really stretched and machine-like. But if I bring the tempo up, it's actually just going to sound really frantic and fast. You are not going to get that machine-like sound. Because when we slow down sound to make it a slower tempo, we're essentially like stretching that audio. And audio can only stretch so much. The audio is captured at a specific sample rate, and when we stretch it so much, eventually we run out of samples. So it's like there's gaps in between each sound. Now those gaps are like nanoseconds or like a tiny increment of time, so it's not pure silence, but I think you can understand that concept. Stretching something is a lot more difficult than just shrinking something when it comes to sound and maintaining its sound. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as we go through this, because warping is ultimately playing with the timing of a sample to get it to fit into another time. But let's look at what's happening with this sample. So down here, I can look at my warping settings. Warp is obviously turned on, and we will see a yellow marker right here at the beginning, and also one all the way down here at the end, just to mark the start and end points. Live did that automatically. And if you notice, there's these little white markers that are on the grid. And as I hover my mouse over here, you might notice that there's a little gray marker that appears. And if I double click, well, I can put my own warp markers in there as well. Now, like I said, Ableton Live already did a great job of warping this and getting this in time. So I don't need to do this unless I want to manipulate this beat. In which case, I could go ahead and manually add markers onto each transient, right? The beginning of each sound, all of those peaks that we see there, the start of each sound. I could do that. And as you can see, actually, this drum loop, it sounds really dope because it's a very human drum beat. So we have little hits. Even this first little hi-hat hit is off the grid a little bit. That's okay. We don't necessarily need to fix that. However, we could add warp markers to each one of these transients, and we could start to not fix it, but manipulate it and move it around. So I could actually drag some of these around and actually totally mess this rhythm up. So let's listen to these first couple bars after I kind of nudge things in different directions. Listen to just this first bar now that I've completely messed up the timing. It's bizarre and it's nothing creative, but you can see that you can have a lot of fun doing that. And don't forget that principle of stretching a sound. We're going to end up with that result of a very sort of mechanical, metallic kind of sound. But shrinking a sound, aka making things closer together like this, like we're shortening that wave when we do that. but this one got super stretched, so it sounds super metallic. And things start to really fall apart the more you stretch them apart. But yes, you can go ahead, add your own warp markers, and start to manipulate certain samples. Like in a drum loop, I might do this if I want the kick to hit on a different beat or something like that. You do want to make sure that when you do this, you mark each transient with a warp marker, because if you don't, and I wanted to adjust where this drum hit lands, well, if I start moving this one around, watch what happens to everything after it in the audio. It also moves. So it's all going to move relative to each other. Whereas if I start marking the next warp markers, it's only going to move this beat between the two warp markers that are surrounding it. So that is something you want to keep in mind if you're going to go ahead and do this. Now I've completely messed up that sample, so let's go ahead and drag in another one. Kind of similar vibe, but let's give it a listen. Again, this sample has a number in the title, 85, which I'm going to go ahead and assume is the BPM of the sample. And what do you know? If we look down here at the warp menu, it says BPM 85. That's because I didn't do anything. Live automatically detected the tempo of this sample. And again, it can do that really easily because this is a drum sample and it has very clear transients. Now, something I kind of yada-yada'd over earlier is our warp modes. If you notice, we have a selection of different warp modes, and not all of these warp modes are in every version of Live. But if you notice, the first one is called Beats Warp Mode. If I play this back for you, now listen to that in comparison to Complex. I don't hear a lot of strong differences. However, these warp modes are useful when you're dealing with different types of samples. Now, Complex, which we'll talk about in a moment, is meant for more complex samples that both have rhythmic elements and harmonic elements. So it's doing a fine job of warping this sample here. But Beats Warp Mode is the ideal warp mode for drum samples. Now, I don't want to get too technical in this tutorial, but within the Beats Warp Mode, we have the option to preserve a certain subdivision of time, like preserve eighth notes specifically, or preserve transients, which is what I would recommend if you've got a big general drum loop. What I will show you though is this transient loop mode drop-down menu, which kind of affects how the sound is played between transients. If I change this to play and stop, you see that arrow, play and stop, and I lower this number, we can actually get a lot tighter sound, and we can take away some of the release of some of the drums. I find this especially useful when working with shaker samples. So let's drop a shaker sample in here. Bring our tempo up closer to the sample's actual tempo. And once again, I switch the loop mode to play and stop, and I lower this number. We get a really tight sound. It almost becomes like a hi-hat. But this is a great way to transform a sample. Maybe you use the tighter version for a verse and then bring the energy up later for a hook. It's a little trick I use in the Beats Warp Mode. But you're probably saying, what the heck, TAETRO? Every time you drop in a sample, the warp mode is automatically set to complex. What's up with that? Well, let's take a look at Live's settings, formerly known as preferences, and go to record, warp, and launch. There's a couple preferences in here that we might want to change depending on your workflow. First of all, loop and warp short samples, I keep that on auto. Auto warp long samples, I keep that off. So imagine if you dropped a whole song into Ableton Live, it might automatically try to start warping that sample. I don't want that, so I have it turned off. You might have a reason to turn it on. And there, of course, we can select the default warp mode, which I choose complex because I feel like complex works really well when it comes to a multitude of sample types. It doesn't mean I don't change this, but by default, complex works really well. I want to talk more about these warp mode types, but first let me open up a project I've been working on that has vocals in it so I can show you how we warp something that's not drums. But before that, if you are making beats and using these warping techniques and you've been following along with the Ableton Live series, you probably are interested in getting your music onto streaming services like Spotify or Apple Music, or having it be in Instagram Reels or TikToks. Whatever it is, you need a distributor for that. I use DistroKid. DistroKid, and they have been my distributor since well before they ever sponsored this channel, and they are the sponsor for today's video. I really like the motto of be prolific, meaning you just pay once per year and you can upload as much music as you want, no paying per release. There's a lot of extras involved with DistroKid that you can take advantage of as a member beyond just regular distribution. One of those being hyperfollow, which I find really useful. It's basically like a link tree for everything related to your music, but they auto-generate it once you put your music out there, and it'll have your Apple Music link, it'll have your Spotify. Also, you can add to it. So with my album, I made a couple videos for the album. I also released the album on Bandcamp, and I put those links all into my hyperfollow link, which I totally customized. So when anybody asks about my latest music, I can just send them one link. They can listen to it everywhere they hear their music, and they can find all the other content too, like the videos. They've got other cool things, like if you want to collaborate with somebody and you want to do splits, it's really simple to do. They've got promo cards, which just generates an image with your album artwork in it to promote your work when it drops. So if all that sounds kind of cool to you, you can support the sponsor today by using the link in the description and getting 7% off your first year of DistroKid. And like I said, been using them since well before they ever sponsored the channel. I've never had any reason to look elsewhere, so I can confidently accept them as my sponsor, and I thank them for supporting the channel and helping me keep this series going. So check out the link in the description if you don't have a distributor yet. DistroKid, highly recommend. Back to warping. All right, so this is a track I've been working on that contains vocal samples, but those vocal samples are not the same tempo as the song, and I'm going to show you how I used warping to make them work. So this is a vocal sample. Put the metronome on so we hear time here, and let's find the sample in the project. Okay, so here is this sample right here. You can see that it's labeled 150 for 150 BPM, but this track is at 95 beats per minute. Now, to show you how I actually did this, I'm going to delete this sample out of the track entirely, and I'm going to bring it back into the project so you can see how Live handles it. To start, let's play back that same spot in the song again. It's completely out of time. Doesn't work at all. Live, you have failed. You were doing such a good job earlier. No, but it's understandable why Live is struggling with this sample versus a drum sample, right? On a vocal sample, if you look at it right here, we can see transients, but those transients don't necessarily indicate like eighth notes or quarter notes. So Live has trouble detecting the BPM of this sample. And like I mentioned before, it does say 150 in the title, but if we check down here, we can see that it says 120. Now, this is how I generally approach warping something like vocals, especially for like maybe even a remix or something, if you don't know the BPM or if you can't get the warping quite right. We need to start down here. And if we already know the tempo of this sample, we just need to change BPM to 150. From there, if I hit play, it works. We are back in time. Okay, that was a simple fix. I want you to also notice that once again, I'm using the complex warp mode. If you don't have access to that, I would recommend tones for a vocal, because like beats is made for beats, tones is meant for tonal content. You will, however, start to hear a difference between these warp modes. Very machine-like. Go back to complex. It deals with that breath a lot better, right? So that is one reason to use Complex or Complex Pro. You'll really start to hear the differences when you start pushing samples to their extremes. Like this sample is at 150 BPM and being slowed down to 95 BPM. So there's stretching going on. Complex is doing a better job of handling that. And real quick, before we move on, we have texture mode, which is something you can use for like big pads or like field recordings, like really textural stuff. And repitch is a warp mode that allows you to actually treat the sample more like a vinyl or a tape. Whereas if you play it here, it's slowing down the sample from 150 to 95, so we're getting a lower pitch. So if you're looking for like a traditional time stretching warp mode, this is the one to go with. And if I keep doing that, and lower it even more. And of course, if we shrink it, we'll get a higher pitch. So that's what repitch is. That can be a lot of fun to play with if you're looking for that like tape style effect. Okay, but like I said, Complex was working better. We could, of course, do Complex Pro as well. You will get different sounds out of those. I will mention that Complex and Complex Pro take up more CPU power. So you might want to freeze tracks when you're using it. Complex is working fine for me here. We're all synced up with our beat again. But I want to show you what happens after this section of the track. We're going to use that same sample again, but watch what happens. We're going to transition from the sample we've been listening to the same sample, but different. See if you can tell the difference. Here it comes. So this sample is playing twice as fast. Here's the slow one. Here's the fast one. These are the same exact sample, so how do we pull that off? Take a look at the sample that I've done some warping to here. If you look down at the BPM value, you can see that it's set to 75 now. Why is it set to 75? Well, that is because I used the divide by 2 button. If I hit the multiply by 2 button, we'll be back up to 150. Jacket time, a much slower sound. Divide by 2 goes down to 75 BPM. Which is twice as fast as what we were hearing before. Now, this is going to take a bit of brain power to wrap your head around. It is a little confusing, and I've already gotten questions about it. Why, if it says BPM 75, is this playing faster than when it says BPM 150? Well, let me try to explain it as simply as possible. This BPM value is what Live recognizes the sample's BPM to be. Once Live knows what the sample's BPM is, it changes, it's warping that sample to match our project BPM, which is 95 BPM in this case. So if the sample is at 150, it needs to come down to 95. Thus, we get a slower sound because it's going from 150 and coming down to 95. If I hit divide by 2 again, and it says BPM 75, now Ableton Live thinks that this sample is set to 75 beats per minute, but our project is at 95. Meaning it's going to speed the sample up to hit 95. Hence, we get a faster sample. I hope that that makes sense. But lesson here is that you can use this divide and times by 2 button to quickly change the timing of your sample in that way. And when you're multiplying or dividing by 2, you're still going to be synced up with your tempo. It's just going to have a different feel, like half time or double time. I hope that helps with that little confusing concept there. Now you can see that I've put some warp markers here and it does sound a little funky. The reason is because once I started getting this playing in double time, I wanted to tighten up a couple of the phrases and it sounds a lot better in context in my opinion. Here we go. Little warping here. Because my drums are actually a little off the grid, so I was using the warp markers here in the vocal sample to slide around these phrases to better match up with the drums. So altogether, it sounds pretty good. And if you take a look at this, I'll just remind you that you can turn off your grid in this window by turning snap to grid off. Here I turned it on, now I turned it off. With it off, I can freely drag these around. I'm not stuck on any of those time increment lines. Lastly, if you want to be confused even more, if you start putting warp markers in and then you start clicking in the space between warp markers, you're going to see the BPM value change. It's because these warp markers, you're push and pulling the sample, so Live is actually in real time dealing with that. You don't need to worry about that. Make sure you have the general BPM set correctly first. place your warp markers as needed. Don't break your brain trying to click all in here and figure out why the BPM is changing. Don't worry about it. And that is the basics of how I use warping for my music. Hopefully you have a little better understanding of how to use warping when you're using samples in Ableton Live. I think there is like kind of one more advanced episode we can make about like, what if you don't know the BPM of a sample? How do you find the BPM and warp it properly? Let me know if that's something you're interested in a comment down below. This video is part of a longer Ableton Live for Beginners series. I've also got music theory for beginners here on this channel and a bunch of other tutorials, so don't sleep on that. But also I'm a musician too, if you guys didn't know that. So if you want to watch some of my live performances and get inspired or just support the work, all of that is also here on the channel as well. Don't forget there's a link to DistroKid's discount 7% off. You can use that if you want to get your music on Spotify and Apple Music and all that, as well as become a channel member. You can get even more content, behind the scenes stuff, members only workshops, Discord community, all that good stuff. That is by becoming a channel member. It's the best way to directly support the channel. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been TAETRO. Have a good one.